So there's this problem you're going to run into creating 3D art for games these days, especially environment art and props, really. Not so much any kind of characters or anything, and that is nowadays you're pushing so much fidelity and detail, but you can't afford to have hundreds of unique assets in your game, right? Like you have to use instances or duplicates of the same mesh and texture over and over and over again because it's still a game. It still has to render in real time. This isn't a movie. We can't spend minutes on it or hours on every frame. But we want to make it look as close to a movie as possible. And the problem that creates is this, right? Like these are some pretty good high detailed walls here. Like these are some nice textures. But this is pretty repetitive. This is the same, going all the way down the wall, piece by piece, the same. As you get higher and higher fidelity assets, that repetition becomes painfully obvious. Whereas, like before, when everything was, very simple and you wouldn't even have detail like this, you just have like a white wall. Like it was fine. It was fine. It was so simple. You didn't need to worry about stuff like this because this detail literally didn't exist. And now it does. And now it's a problem because we need this detail. But ideally, you don't want this obviously repetitive detail. Like, if the player notices this, and there's a very good chance they will, it's really going to break the immersion if they realize this pattern they see is literally everywhere in your game. But there are some very clever and somewhat simple ways to avoid this without creating tons of unique textures and meshes. And that's what I want to go over here real quick. So over here I have some different pieces with a similar but different material. And you'll see this material, the damage as I scroll this piece around, it changes, even as it goes back. Because this damage is being blended onto the wall based on 3D noise and world space. And what that means is we can use the same texture, the same model, but we can dynamically generate this unique detail based on its position in the world. Which means that we can instance these things and reuse the same asset over and over and over again, and not end up with painfully repetitive detail everywhere. I mean, it's not totally different. Like, these still look similar, but they do not look like that wall I showed you a minute ago. Also doing a few other things. You can't, I mean, you don't only have to like blend on damage detail. Also the wood grain. I don't know if you can tell, but the wood grain changes as well. Also, there's some slight, like it's very hard to pick up, honestly. You gotta turn down a lot. But there is some world space mesh deformation going on to the wooden beams on this material, but it's very, very subtle right now. Just enough to try to keep the lines from being exactly perfectly straight. Because, like, there's a very fine difference between straight and perfectly straight. And perfectly straight looks weird. Nearly perfectly straight looks good. And so what we want is, a very subtle breakup. And I'm going to show you the material doing all this here in a minute. So now this is not the prettiest material, and I have not really worked that hard to optimize this. This is kind of something I threw together. But I'm going to walk through what it does. And I have these handy little commented sections here. Here we have the noise mask. And all this is it's taking the absolute world position to a noise node, which right now is using a fast gradient it's generating. Then I have this to control the hardness of that noise, basically. This really just pumps up the value and then I clamp it so I can end up with a harder or a softer edge or fall off on the noise. And then I have this damage texture here, which I lerp with the base textures down here. And this is for the wall damage. Then I've got the wood world space texture panning, I call it, which I take the actor position. This is to control kind of I called it a threshold. Not really sure what the best word for this is, but it affects kind of how much distance, or if you move the mesh or the actor, that number there will change how quickly the texture pans. That's what it does. So that's why I called it Wood World Space Change Threshold. So you take the actor position, you do need to divide it by something, a number roughly this size. Doesn't have to be 420, but it might as well be. Then I take this vector here, and this is really just to cancel out any Z stuff. Actually, I feel like I don't need this, honestly. But, making materials through the night, you tend to, it doesn't always end up perfectly. Doesn't end up perfectly. I forget. Then you take texture coordinate, add it together. I added to this wooden sheet to its UVs. This is just a texture of wood. And it's very, very exciting and complicated there. And basically what this will do is it will pan across this wood sheet here. And the reason this works is because I'm just now realizing this doesn't really make sense or do anything on its own. But what I'm doing is I'm using the alpha channel of my base color, and I've basically masked out a few parts of my UV space. I masked out the wall and the wood beams for the model, because the model consists of thatch, wood, and that wall, which is like a wattle and daub. It's like plaster and wood, basically. And I'm doing some, like, I forget what all these do, but I'm just kind of, in a not particularly clever way, separating the different masks. I think because I'm using like an alpha value of like below 0.5 and above 0.5, and then to kind of create two alpha masks in the alpha channel. So then I'm separating them, separating the wood from the wall mask, so I can pan the wood pieces around this giant wood sheet texture here. This is all one continual tiling wood texture. And then I have my displacement and tessellation here. You will need some tessellation for any kind of displacement to work really well. Like I was saying, I set it up so there'd be some slight mesh deformation to kind of break up the smooth lines. And for that, all you really need to do, like this is just a very simple, straightforward tessellation setup, camera position, world position, and this is just you need this so you're not tessellating the mesh like all the time. The amount of tessellation is based on how close the camera gets. And I've basically set up these parameters here so it blends in and out very smoothly as you get closer and further away. And the world displacement's very, very simple as well. And it would probably be more optimized if I just used the same noise mask, but I wanted a slightly different noise mask, and so I put a different one in here. You can see this is just fast noise gradient, scale of 0.01, lat of 0.69s. And like, you're going to want to play with these settings for whatever you're doing. Again, it's world position based. I don't want the same noise pattern or anything. I want everything to be different based on world position, right? And so this is just a very simple, relatively lightweight way of being able to take the same mesh, the same textures, and then dynamically, based on world position, alter them. So we can get different wood grains, different damage patterns, and also different mesh deformation based on where the mesh is in world space. Because I mean, it's obvious with like the wall damage, but even the wood grain, if you saw those same wood grain everywhere in a game, that would be repetitive. And now that games are using assets with fidelity where you can really see the wood grain like clearly, it doesn't just look like a muddy wood color and wood shaped thing. Like you can really see the grain, really see the crack, the shape of the plaster, the damage. Now that's getting so high fidelity, you really need to use tricks like this if you want your game to, actually run, look nice. Like this is absolutely essential for modern game art creation. And so this is an important technique for anyone learning this stuff. Like you're going to need to know this if you want to seriously make games. If you want like a really in-depth technical breakdown, like a walkthrough of me doing this, let me know. I might do that later anyway. I just kind of wanted to briefly explain why this is important and show off how it works. But yeah, I'm definitely considering going more in depth and doing a step by step. So, anyone interested, let me know. Hopefully, this was informational and helpful. I know this is something I would have liked to know earlier on, learning about game art, honestly. So I'm hoping maybe someone will find this and it'll be helpful to them early on. Yeah. Have a good day.